Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another instance of English 372. We've got another asynchronous video for you today. This is our last one. Woo, we're almost there. It is December here, and we're pushing towards the end. This is, like I said, the last asynchronous class. We're going to have one more synchronous class meeting on Monday, so don't miss out on that one. In that one, we're going to be doing a bunch of different things. We're going to be well, not too many things, a few different things. One of the things we're going to be doing is wrapping up some of these discussion points that have come up over the past couple lectures, and will continue to come up during today's lecture as well. So we want to talk about, have some of these discussions for these talking points that we've brought up during these classes, and also kind of use that as a way to review these past few asynchronous lectures. If there's anything that wasn't clear or you have questions about, that's a good time to bring those up as well. And then we're going to wrap up the semester with a little bit of review. We can talk about your papers if you like. We can talk about the class in general, and then I'll leave some time at the end just to take any questions that you have. Those questions can be anything. They can be about sociolinguistics, they can be about lecture material, they can be about your papers, they can be about the field of linguistics in general. I just want to make sure that we leave some space to have some sort of closing conversations if we need to have them on Monday. And if we don't need to have them and we feel like we've got it, that's fine too. There's no pressure for it on that time, but I do want to leave some time for that. Cool. Sweet. So let's hop into today's topic. Today, what I want to talk about is linguistic activism. What is the role of a linguist or somebody trained who knows something about linguists? Congratulations. If you weren't already there, you guys count as linguists now. You've graduated to that point, so I'm including you in this group. What do we do about a lot of these issues that we've seen throughout this semester? We've highlighted a decent number of, I would characterize them as problematic scenarios, right? When we look at things like racial inequality and the role that language plays in it. When we look at things like these linguistic ideologies that have negative consequences for the people around us. There's a bunch of these spots of problems that we've been highlighting and looking at the role that language plays in both the problem itself and possibly the solution. And today we want to focus a little more on the solutions. What do we do about this? And specifically, what's the role of a linguist in solving these problems? So it's going to be a little bit more practical is a weird word for it, but it's kind of the best I can come up with at the moment. It's going to be a little bit more practical side of what it means to be a linguist. So linguistics, hopefully this much is clear at this point, is an academic discipline, right? So one part of what it means to be a linguist is to be researching and publishing and teaching within this academic sphere of linguistics. That's a huge portion of what linguistics is as an academic discipline. But there's another portion which reaches out, is a little more outward facing, not quite as inward facing towards the academics, but has some effects on our world. And that's what we're going to look at today. And we're going to springboard off of what we talked about last class, which was these ideas of linguistic ideologies, particularly surrounding things like multilingualism. Right? We looked at, where am I? We looked at these different case scenarios where we looked at how different linguistic ideologies were happening within language policy and planning, whether that was in Turkish or in Kenya or in Europe, in the United States or in Russia. So we're going to build our ideas of activism here through these notions of ideology, especially for this first one. Here's three rough areas. This is a bit of a ragtag, finish things up lecture, so if I'm a little disjointed today, you'll cut me some slack. But we're roughly going to look at sort of three small areas here. We're going to look at language use in the classroom with particular focus on bilingualism and see how ideologies play a role in these varying competing notions of bilingualism. We'll look quickly then, language in the courtroom and the role that linguistics plays there, and I want to revisit and recap just a couple quick points on language revitalization as another sort of instance where linguistics is outward facing and outward reaching. Cool. So again, like I said, springboarding off of the ideologies, let me shrink myself a little bit here. The ideologies that we were looking at in Monday's class, we can see that another ideology that we didn't quite have time to address grows out of these pre-existing conditions. So we talked about the one nation, one language ideology in Wednesday's class, in the last lecture, right? This idea that for every country there's one singular national language, a very Eurocentric sort of ideology there, but it stands nonetheless. And this idea that monolingualism, a push towards monolingualism, often supported by language policy and planning, is for functional reasons, right? It's to make communication easier. If everybody speaks the same language, that's much easier administratively, through business, economically, whatever, in schools. These work together. And what they work together to form is this idealization of monolingualism in the United States as sort of the default, the unmarked. We can think of when we were talking about different marked forms, when we were looking at gender earlier in the semester, it makes monolingualism the default or unmarked state within the United States. And it casts that as not just the way that it is, which is at least more somewhat supported by data, but the way that it ought to be. The monolingualism myth, we're going to call that. And an extension of this is that there's this idea that's pervasive in American culture that people can only learn one language well. This is what makes monolingualism the ideal state, is that you can only learn one language well. So if you dabble, any other languages that you dabble in is only going to decrease your proficiency at the one language that you're learning well. This is not reality, mind you. This is perception. I think if we want to be in tune with our own perceptions of these sorts of things, and see if we find them there. And if we do, we want to reanalyze them with our current given knowledge. And if we don't, then we're great and we want to see it in the world around us, because I do think it exists in the world around us. The way I like to talk about this, the way I think this even gets talked about, maybe not this explicitly, is what we'll call the economic model of language learning. And so what it seems like in this perception is that we imagine that we have $10 to spend on language points, on language learning points. We have $10. And so we can either spend all 10 of our dollars on English, and we can learn English really well. We'll have, we did the complete purchase. We got all the DLC for English. Or we can split up our language learning dollars and spend 5 on English and say spend 5 on Spanish. That will mean that we're bilingual, but it means in this conception of the way that language works that, we only have 5 English dollars spent. We don't know English as well as the person who spent $10 on English, right? That it somehow lessens, that this bilingualism lessens our linguistic abilities in any one given language. I think that's the perception. And what I want to say to you in response to that is that this could not be further from the truth. This is not, this perception, this monolingualism myth, this economic model of language learning is total crap. It doesn't check out, right? There's no science. Study after study after study within linguistics looking at multilingualism disproves this perspective on language learning. Study after study shows us that bilingualism, rather than being a detractor for the primary language or a detractor in cognition or a detractor in academic performance, is quite the opposite. Bilingualism and multilingualism is a huge asset to a child or a human for that matter. They've shown that, here's a good list, bilingual children are more likely to have stronger skills in problem solving, in working memory, in self-control, in adaptation, and in conflict resolution. With no downsides, by the way. There's no corresponding list of things that bilingual children are worse at. That's just not a thing. It's just not a thing. They've also shown that even within language itself, that bilingualism and multilingualism increases a child's linguistic agility and creativity and comprehension in some ways, right? So that children use language in using language in more than one way actually become more adept at control over and understanding differential language use, when to use what kind of language. So it's actually a big asset. And again, see the discrepancy here between what all the science is telling us, what all the data is showing us, and nevertheless, this persistent monolingualism myth, right? This monolingualism myth has a quite long history in the United States. It's one of the reasons we see as a destination for large amounts of immigrant population over the past 200 years. We see this kind of classic three-generation model for language shift, where parents will come to the United States not speaking English. So they're the generation one and they speak whatever their native language was. Then they have kids in the United States, that's the generation two, and generation two speaks both the ancestral language and English. They're bilingual. They're bilingual here in generation two. And then generation three only speaks English. Has lost access to the ancestral language. So within a couple generations, right, within 2 generations down, from generation 1 to generation 3, we see a total language shift often in a lot of immigrant populations to the United States. That's the case historically, and it's also the case to a large extent still today. And part of that, there are other factors going on in that, but part of that, I think, is this pervasive myth of the economic model that it's good to only speak English because then you'll speak it better. Sure. All right, let's continue talking about that just from a different. What this leads us to is different types of bilingualism and different types of multilingualism. So here's two different, they're described as two different types of bilingualism, which is additive bilingualism versus subtractive bilingualism. And this is something that we particularly want to be aware of as in the classroom. So this is related in some ways to classroom behavior, if you're an ESL teacher or something like that. Additive bilingualism is when a second language is added onto an individual's repertoire of languages. Apparently I can't apostrophe there. We'll fix that real quick. It's added on without a change in the L1 proficiency. So I speak English and I learn Spanish. I add on Spanish as a proficiency that I have, making me bilingual. It's not true, but I wish it was. That's additive bilingualism. In contrast to this, in many situations, what we find happening is called subtractive bilingualism. This is also known as language shift in a different sector of linguistics literature. And this is where a second language is added. So I speak Spanish as my L1, and I come to the United States, and I learn English as my L2. But over time, as I use my L2 English more and more and more, I use it at school, I use it at church, I use it wherever, at my job, I start to lose proficiency in my L1, to lose proficiency in Spanish over time due to increased use of the L2. So this is subtractive bilingualism in the sense that you added one thing, you added an L2, but you added it at the cost of your L1. It cost you something. It's subtractive, or substitutive is probably a better term for this kind of thing, but I don't make these terms, so who knows. Where the other one is just strictly additive. You're not losing anything. There's no cost in that sense. Cool. And so we want to think about how we can promote additive bilingualism. Additive bilingualism is just like clearly the better way, right? Like that's just clearly what we're after. How can we promote additive bilingualism instead of subtractive bilingualism? And I think that one of the things that's very important to understand is that these two situations, these two types of bilingualism arise out of different situations, in different circumstances. Think about that. These two things happen in different circumstances. They're largely predictable, not based on, instead of being up to an individual, they're largely predictable based on circumstances. Under what circumstances, I want you to ask yourself now, do we find each of these? Under what linguistic or social circumstances do we find additive bilingualism, and what are the linguistic and social circumstances under which we find subtractive bilingualism? By thinking, I'm vamping for a second while you think about that. Feel free also to pause the video. What we want to do in identifying these circumstances is it's going to help us target interventions to wherever we find subtractive bilingualism, we want to target that for an intervention so we can change that policy, tendency, whatever we want to call it. Okay, cool. Essentially, one of the big factors in the circumstances that dictate which of these you're going to get is a power dynamic between the L1 and the L2. It's a linguistic and thus, as a result, also a social dynamic. So additive bilingualism tends to happen when the L1 that the speaker starts with is a prestigious dominant language. I used that specifically when I talked about this. I said that if you're an English speaker and you learn Spanish, that often results in additive bilingualism because your L1 is the prestige dominant language. This is an American-centric. Because this is culturally contextual, this is in an American context that we're talking about these things. If your L1's dominant, you're less likely to lose proficiency in it when you learn an L2, resulting in additive bilingualism. And the opposite is true if your L1 is the minority, not prestige language, and the L2 that you learn is the majority or prestige language. If you speak an indigenous language of the Americas and you learn English as your L2, you're incentivized in some ways. The incentive to speak your L1 can, unfortunately, fade somewhat. You're more likely to just use that prestige L2 more and more and more, causing your proficiency in your L1 to fade. So a lot of what's happening here is a power imbalance between languages and cultures there, between the linguistic dynamics between a prestige language and a not prestige language. Hopefully that makes some sense. So we can see that these are places that helps us to focus our efforts as both linguists and language activists for where we can kind of try and spot subtractive bilingualism and support it to become additive as well. And how do we do that? How do we, seeing both what's happening here in subtractive bilingualism and understanding where subtractive bilingualism tends to happen, how can we address these issues? How can we address these issues? We already spent a reasonable amount of time talking about this earlier when we were talking about the Oakland Ebonics controversy, which has a lot of strong parallels to this sort of bilingualism, right? That's actually one of the thrusts of what the Oakland Ebonics controversy was talking about, was treating speakers of AAVE, African American Vernacular English, as foreign language speakers, right? Tying us into this idea of different types of bilingualism. And so some of the things we learned when we were talking about that are applicable to these situations are continuing to value a speaker's L1 as you teach them the L2. Making sure that we value L1 competency in students as we teach them an L2. As you teach an ESL, English as a second language, as you teach English to a student who didn't come to your classroom speaking or having a good grasp on English, you encourage continued use and value the L1. Right? So this can look in the case of AAVE and Standard American English. This has looked in the past like teachers valuing the ability to translate from one to the other, to translate from the L1 to the L2. That ability inherently values itself a grasp of the L1, because you can't do that translation if you don't understand the L1. It's like a way to increase the status in some ways of that L1. Or there's other teaching methods that have been looked at where they have people just write increased literacy in their L1 language as well. So when you're encouraging students, when you have students write an essay, you can have them switch between doing it in SAE and Standard American English or doing it in their L1. Right? In the Oakland Ebonics situation, what they had students do was write personal essays about what their home life is like, what's a good memory, what's their favorite memory at home, and they had them write these essays or stories. These were younger children. They had them write these stories in their home dialect, right? In the way that they speak, actually, in AAVE, to write in that. And these sorts of activities that give students agency or about how they write. They don't always have to write in Standard American English, and they show that there is a literacy possible in AAVE as well, helps to raise and value that status of the L1, hopefully leading us towards additive bilingualism and away from subtractive bilingualism. And one of the underlying factors that is going on here in whether somebody does lose proficiency in an L1 or not is an issue of language maintenance that gets talked about a lot, and in particular it's this idea of using language use. Not framing this very well, give me a second. You're more likely to maintain a language if it has a place, a venue, or a space in which use of that language is the norm. So we want to reconceptualize language use in our day-to-day behavior as happening in certain venues. We'll talk about these as happening in certain venues. So there's a way that I speak when I'm giving a lecture online. There's a way that I speak at Calvin University. There's a way that I speak at home. There's a way that I speak at a restaurant with friends. Can't anymore. I might be losing that due to COVID, but there's different venues. There's a way that I speak at church, very much so. There's a way that I speak at all these different places. There's a way that I speak when I go to the DMV or some other administrative building, hopefully, with grace and love is how I speak there. But yeah, there's all these different places. And a good sign of language maintenance meaning that people won't lose proficiency, or at least won't lose as much proficiency in a language, is if one of these, at least one, preferably more of these venues, is dedicated. The default language of that venue is the language that we're trying to maintain. So what happens in subtractive bilingualism that's problematic is that speakers, problematic in the sense that they lose the language. I mean, yeah, we got to keep the scope of these problems in mind, I think. What happens is that the L2, something like English or the prestige language, goes through and it takes over all of these different venues. So your L2 English becomes the language of education. It's the language you speak at school. That one often happens right away. But we can see that English is also the language that many people use in administrative official things. Like I said, if you go to, the DMV, or you go to vote, or you go to do whatever else you want, you're going to be using English in these administrative places. It's also often the language of workplace in the United States. It can sometimes be the language of church, and then typically the last one to go to make that change, and when it becomes extra problematic, is when the L2 becomes the language of home. This is often the last bastion of L1 venue use. If that happens, then it's very, very difficult to maintain a language. It's very difficult to maintain a language if it's not the default way that you speak given certain circumstances. And so we can think, this gives us a conceptual way to think about something like language maintenance. All right, cool. Last thing I want to talk about, bilingualism, multilingualism. I'm not going to talk as much about the other two. We're spending most of our time here. We're looking at time and getting worried at this point, like I am. The last thing I want to mention about multilingualisms is back to these ideologies. So one thing that I want to talk about is, are things changing? So I presented to you this view of the monolingual myth, which idealizes monolingualism, puts that on a pedestal at the expense of multilingualism. And I want to ask, is that still the case today? Or is America changing? These perceptions are constantly in flux, so I always like to weigh in here. So I'm going to ask you, this is something I'm going to ask you about, make myself a little bigger. This is something I'm going to ask you about on Monday. Is this still the case that America doesn't value multilingualism as much as it should, as much as it values monolingualism? I'm going to ask you that. I want you to think about that. And alongside with that, I hope what you said, I hope in your head or out loud, or if you paused this video and thought about it, your reaction was like, I think that it's starting to change. I think that the United States is starting to value multilingualism more than it did a generation ago or two. Right? I think that's the case. I hope that's the case, and I hope that you think that's the case too, because we're the ones that can make that happen. But I want to be, that's optimism. That's some optimism on a Friday in December of 2020 here. That's optimism, but I want to temper that optimism a little bit, because I think there's another split that we can see. I do think that America is starting to value multilingualism more, but it's starting to value multilingualism disproportionately or unevenly across the population in a way that we really need to be cognizant of and check, right? That bilingualism is seen as a good thing in the United States, starting to be seen as a good thing, but only for certain populations, not for others. And you can see this dichotomy, this cognitive dissonance, this prejudice showing up in how we view multilingualism, such that a white kid who goes to a private school and has Mandarin Chinese classes as part of that private school education that is seen by, again, I'm stereotyping and generalizing here, but hopefully it gets the point across. That is seen as a good thing. How cool that, this school is teaching Mandarin. Isn't that neat? Isn't that cool that this student will speak English and have some proficiency in Mandarin? That's seen as a positive thing. That's called elite bilingualism. Yet, immigrant populations coming to the United States, immigrant populations coming from China, to keep that example consistent, speaking Mandarin, upon showing up in the United States and speaking some English, their multilingualism isn't valued in the same way as it is for the rich white kid. What are they told? Learn English. Stop speaking Chinese. You're in America now, speak English. Speak American, right? That's the prejudice, again, this kind of cognitive dissonance. And again, one of the take-homes of that this highlights very aggressively for us is that this is clearly not about language. That issue, the discrepancy between these two situations of bilingual English and Chinese speakers and how they're treated and how they're valued in the United States, clearly shows that this isn't about language. That's just racism, right? Like, that's just prejudice. That's what's going on there. It's couched in terms of language, in terms of you're in America, speak English, speak American, whatever. But it's clear that that's just racially motivated rather than linguistically motivated, highlighted by this discrepancy between different types of multilingualism. All right, sweet. What time is it? How am I doing? All right, I got to keep going. So again, we're trickling through these kind of like connected ideas in a chain here. Connected to that one is this idea, another discussion point which I want you to be thinking about and we'll hit upon on Monday, is that are language rights human rights? When do we have the right to speak how we want to speak? Do people have the right to speak the language they want in various situations? It sounds like a kind of silly question, but it's not really, right? It's not actually a simple or easy question, right? I think on one end, we talk about different situations and it's simple, right? If I ask you the question, like, do people have the right to speak whatever language they want at home? I hope that you just say, yeah, duh. Like, of course they do. Why would anybody care about what language they speak at home? And they shouldn't. But as we get progressively further into these situations, do people have the right to speak whatever language they want at work and expect to be understood? Or what about in the government? Or what about in our court system? These are tougher questions, right? Because we can clearly see that the United States just isn't set up for this to be the case. People cannot just go into government situations not speaking English and speaking a language, Chinese for instance, and expect that to work. Now, should they be able to? Quite possibly, and we can make that argument that they should be able to, right? We should at least be set up for that in the sense that we could get a translator in that scenario to make that situation work for them and not discriminate against them based on the languages that they speak. That's a reasonable argument, but the reality of the situation in the United States is that is often not the case, right? Like, again, I don't know why I'm using the DMV as my administrative example. It's a very strange one, but I'm going to stick with it. I've gone too far at this point in the lecture, right? You can't just show up at the DMV and expect that they have translators into whatever language you want. There's push and pull here on expectations and rights in different scenarios, right? And there's a tension that arises out of this. I'm going to talk about the court system in just a second and give you an example of linguistics in the court. But this is a larger order question that we're going to hit upon. I'm going to bring back around, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on Monday. So let's talk about courts quickly. Courts are a site of language use and language importance, right? So think about courts and the way that they operate, and we see that they're set up to prioritize language. When people give testimony, for instance, the words that come out of their mouth, the language that they use is held in extremely high regard, such that it often has a determining factor on the outcome of a court case. What somebody says is often what determines the outcome of a court case. That's a lot of pressure and priority placed on language use in a courtroom. And so it's a site where we as linguists, our little linguist ear radars, need to perk up and pay attention to what's going on to this place which claims to, which has such a stressor and such importance on language. Because it's a site where things often don't go well as a result of this, as a result of people not understanding the full range of language and the full social and historical implications of linguistics and language use. So I want to talk quickly about a case study, a sad one, that highlights this concern, that highlights this potential for need for linguistic intervention. And this is the case of Trayvon Martin, who was a 17-year-old man who was shot and killed as he was walking home, I believe. And as part of this case, they brought in, it's a tragic case. I hope you're aware of it, and feel free to Google the details of this. We're not going to dwell on that as much as we probably should. But as part of this case, one of the key witnesses is this woman, Rachel Jeantel, and it's Trayvon Martin's very good friend. Since kindergarten, they've been friends, and Rachel Jeantel is the last person to have talked to Trayvon Martin on the phone shortly before he was shot and killed. So he's talking to her about being scared, about somebody following him shortly before he dies. It's truly tragic and truly traumatizing. Can you imagine what that's like? So he was on the phone with Rachel Jeantel, telling her about how he was worried about how there was somebody following him, etc., before that man then killed him. Imagine the trauma, to put ourselves in the necessary context here for this, if this is you and this is something that happened to your childhood friend. And so Rachel Jeantel gets up on the stand and gives testimony. And this testimony that she gives is intensely criticized by the US media. And it's intensely criticized because of the way that Rachel Jeantel speaks, because of her linguistic habits, because she speaks non-standard English. And what's going on there is that people actually directly and explicitly called her testimony into question, called the validity, the authenticity of her testimony into question because she used a non-standard variety of English. Think about how messed up that is, right? People were less likely, they called her testimony into question because she didn't speak standard American English. Here's a quote, right? That people seem to agree that language is this profound mark of education and worth. And you can often beat up on it. You can pick on language when you want to beat up on other aspects of people without fear of being criticized. So there are many things that Rachel Jeantel represents, but she is herself a victim. This is her childhood friend. She knew him from kindergarten. She's talking about what she heard, and instead she's the one being put on trial. Not only by the defense attorney, but by all of America. She's the one that's on trial to defend herself, the fact in her testimony of what she heard, as people attack her personally, and they do that through attacking her language use, her linguistic behavior. And so this is a site where we can clearly see as sociolinguists using the information that we've learned over the course of the semester exactly what's going on here. That people are using language as a proxy. It's never about language, it's about the people. They're using it as a proxy for racism. We can see that. We can see the indexicality, the indexical moves and the indexical associations that are being carried out here, which smack of racism. People hear non-standard English and they connect that indexically to lack of education, and lack of education to lack of trustworthiness, and so they lambaste this woman, this traumatized woman, on a national stage, on national television, and don't take her testimony to be authentic or truthful, that she must be lying based on these unfounded indexical associations that they carry with them, that really are racial baggage of racism. Right? We can see that. I hope that this class has armed you to see that, those moves going on here. And so what needs to happen in these situations is we need to promote understanding of these issues in a larger forum. This can't stay academic anymore, right? People have published articles about this, linguists, about this situation, and that's a great start, but that's not enough. We can't publish articles in a linguistics journal and expect that to change things, because that's not who needs to hear it. That's not who needs to hear it. The American public needs to hear it. The American judicial system needs to hear it. The American educational systems need to hear it. We need to get in on other demographics with this perspective, right? And we're not this isn't unique to linguistics necessarily. It's not like linguistics is the only people. You have to be trained in linguistics to understand that this is messed up. No, many people understood that this is messed up, but not enough. But not enough. And so that's where we need to be inserting ourselves as language experts. And how to do that is a difficult proposition. I mean, within the educational systems, there's sort of a more prescribed. I'm more aware of the workings of an educational system, being an educator myself, so that I can speak to more. That we can start these types of training. We can actually include elements of linguistics and sociolinguistics into curriculum, not in college, but before, right? Actually, in grade school, there's been some pushes to already begin talking about language and identity, language and the back and forth and its ability to create and index identities in early, like in middle school, like in 7th and 8th grade, and that's shown pretty good success, right? So we can inject some of the knowledge that we have earlier into the American population through educational systems. What the solution is for the court system, again, I feel out of my league here, but it needs to be addressed anyway. I don't know what that looks like, if there's linguistic retainers that court systems will hold, or translators, an increase of translators for different dialects of English, whatever. Something needs to go on here to prevent these types of situations, certainly. Cool. Okay, the last one I want to talk about. We talked about language revitalization. I want to just hit upon that quickly again. So again, this is the impetus, the motivation here is that the last speaker of half the world's languages are alive today. That's a sobering thought. Read that one again. I'll read it again as well. The last speaker, the person who will eventually become the last speaker of half the world's languages, is alive today. As that person grows old and die, their voices will grow silent, will fall silent. Their children and grandchildren will either choose not to learn or will be deprived of the opportunity to learn their ancestral language. That's Harrison in 2007. That's a little doomsday, and it's not a guarantee. this is a projection. This half the world's languages will be extinct in the next 100 years, if not more. But it's a soundly based projection. And so there's this factor again to remind us that languages are going extinct. And this is another area in which linguists are outward facing rather than inward academic facing. We participate in language maintenance, which I talked about a little bit earlier with seeing the different venues that one of the big factors is seeing the different venues that a language is used in, but also linguistic and language revitalization, which is a situation in which linguists go into communities and they work with communities in which the language use is fading, in which there's L1 attrition, right? In which the ancestral indigenous native language of that community is ceding ground to English, as English as is an Anglo-centric one. Language revitalization happens all around the world for a bunch of different reasons, but typically there's a prestige language that's encroaching and being used more, while the native indigenous language is being used less and less. And so what a linguist will do is come into a community at the behest of that community. They would just show up one day and say, like, I'm a linguist, bum, bum, bum. Like, no, they have to be invited. As I'll give you a quote to support in just a second, but they're invited to work with communities by the communities, and they work with them to promote language revitalization, to promote language use shifting back in the other direction, for the native language to reclaim ground in the face of whatever the prestige language is for that community, and thus to prevent loss of that language, to encourage children to speak the language and use the language at home and at work and etc. Does this work? Does language, what's the success of language revitalization? And it actually does work. Not always, but it can. And so we want to look just briefly here at the end of class. I realize I'm running out of time. We want to look at when it works and when it doesn't work. And for this, I have a quote from Daryl Baldwin, and he talks about, I'll just read the quote, for languages that are heavily recorded, and that there's a community that wants to start speaking a language again, and there's tribal leadership that wants to support these initiatives, then who's to say that they can't find new domains for their language to live? So what Daryl Baldwin is saying here is that some of the key factors for language revitalization being successful is the community buy-in. Community interest is the number one predictor of success with regards to language revitalization projects, right? And that makes sense. Like, if the community doesn't want to, it's hard work basically, and if the community doesn't want to put in the hard work necessary to make language revitalization happen, then like us as linguists, like, what are we supposed to do about it? There's nothing that we can do about that. And that's maybe okay too. We need to, again, balance this. A quick note on Daryl Baldwin. So Daryl Baldwin worked with the Myaamia people. This is an indigenous language group in the United States whose language at one point wasn't spoken by anybody. It was a sleeping language, they call it, what they used to call a dead language. Now they call it a sleeping language. And this sleeping language had no speakers whatsoever. Had maybe some people knew a few words, but nobody spoke this language actively. And what Daryl Baldwin and the Myaamia tribe did, they had a bunch of records of this language. Right? They had historical records of this language being spoken, and what the structures, what the forms were. They had good documentation of the language. And so what happened was they revitalized this totally defunct sleeping language. They started teaching language classes in the community because they had the information, right? They had the records. Even though they didn't have native speakers to teach, to pass it on generationally, they still had records to produce educational materials. So they started teaching Myaamia in classes to tribal members. And there was a huge community push that wanted to reclaim their cultural heritage and start speaking this language again, to the point where it was successful. And there are now speakers of Myaamia where there wasn't 20 years ago. Sorry, 1 second. Where there wasn't 20 years ago. Which is really cool. I think including Daryl Baldwin's kids. I think they're also, like, I don't know, somewhat native speakers of Myaamia, which is awesome. That's really, really cool. I find it to be an inspirational story of language revitalization and cultural revitalization success. It's one of the things that linguists can help with. I wanted to say that's something that linguists offer, but that's not the case. It's not just like we have this thing we can do, but we can assist with these different processes. Cool. I will stop there. Here's a video. I'll post this link in various places as well. It's another one about language revitalization that we're probably not going to have time to talk about. I might play it on Monday depending on how that goes, but it's a really cool piece about alternate paths and using technology and actually video games. It's a specialty. Using video games to aid with something like cultural revitalization and linguistic revitalization. So I'm going to leave us there. We're going to talk about this topic more on Monday as well. And talk. These are three big ways essentially that linguists tend to get involved in practical activist social activism causes through education, through the court system, and through language revitalization. On Monday, one of the things I want to talk about, so you can be thinking about it, is how can you help? Right? You're unlikely to pioneer a new. None of these things are beyond you, by the way, but unless you go on to receive future training, maybe we're not all going to get into the court system and change things there. We're probably not all going to get into the educational system and change things there, although some of us very well may. But what can we do in our day-to-day lives? How can we be everyday advocates? How can we use linguistic knowledge to change perceptions, to change indexical values in the United States, and to combat some of the negative ideologies and negative associations that we see around us? That's what we're gonna finish up with on Monday as we wrap up this semester. We're gonna leave it with a bit of a practical bend. So I'm over time, so I'm gonna leave us there. But I hope you guys think about these things and we can have a productive discussion on Monday. And I hope you have a great weekend. Catch you guys for our last class on Monday.